Hey everybody, sit down around the hearth, grab a frosty mug of ale. Welcome to the Lion's Pride Tavern, where we discuss all things Azeroth. Hey everybody, tonight we talk about our raid as normal, but we also want to educate some of our new NOOB players on World of Warcraft Lingo. We also want to talk about the new 7.1.5 patch coming out Tuesday. So let's start off with introductions. I'm your host, Faffard. I play a Dwarven Beastmaster Hunter in the awesome game World of Warcraft. Next up, we have Jobui.
Hi, I'm Jobui of the Jungle. I play a Worgen Fire Mage.
Next up is Laureli.
Hi, it's Laureli, your Night Elf Fury Warrior.
And then there's Epistle.
Hello, Epistle, the patient. Draenei, Protection Paladin.
Tapachino is not with us tonight. She's got some family business, but she may join us, depending on how long that takes. So let's start off with our raid. We raided Friday and Saturday. Jobui, you want to give us a recap?
Yeah, sure. We decided to go back and hit Emerald Nightmare Heroic and just kind of make a push on that. We're heading in towards Nighthold coming out soon, and there's a number of people that wanted to hit up Emerald Nightmare again and take on some of those bosses. So on our first night of raiding, we managed to get through to, I think we got through the first three bosses. So we took out Nelthendra, and then we took on Ursoc, and then we went after the double dragons. And then on our second night, we took on the spider boss, managed to defeat that after some tweaking for the first time on Heroic for us. And then we went after the tree and did pretty well, really, against the tree. We didn't have a whole lot of time at the tree. We only got a few pulls in, but we got fairly close, and I think with a little bit of tweaking that out, we should be able to take it down next week, since we're planning on continuing from that point.
Right. Now, you want to talk, let's talk a little bit about strategy changes with each of our classes. So, Laureli, what did you see change difference between our normal play and our heroic play on any of the bosses? I'll let you choose.
I'll start with Nathandriel, I guess, the first dragon. I think it was pretty much the same. There wasn't really any different strategies that we had to use, but I saw a lot of people that just were not doing the mechanics right. There was a lot of rot being run back into the group. People weren't letting it drop in time. And on heroic, those kinds of mistakes are very costly. So I think what people have to do is get back into the mindset that I've got to do all of these mechanics correctly. Otherwise, we're going to spend a lot of time wiping when we really shouldn't have to. I was paying more attention for the first three bosses, and I think that's what I saw with all of them, is that mechanics just weren't really being followed.
And do you think that was possibly because we hadn't been through it in a while, or what?
I think that's part of it. I know it's hard for me to get back into a raid when I haven't done one for a couple of weeks. And I think it also shows that we've gotten a little comfortable. Our gear levels were high enough on normal that it really wasn't a problem. We could go through quite a few bosses in a night. And people tend to so I'm going to stand in it a little bit longer because it didn't hurt me before, but now it really hurts.
How about Epistle? What did you see changed between normal and heroic?
Well, Ursoc was a completely different fight in some ways. Rather than handling a damage debuff by having groups go off in sort of two different directions, we're actually doing it in a circle around the perimeter of the room, and that complicates things in an interesting and challenging way. One of the tricks too is there's, without going into great detail, there's a tank swap that needs to happen so that no tank has two debuffs on them at the same time. And when you're doing that while on the move, while trying to make sure you're not dying because he deals a lot of damage, it can be quite a bit of pressure. So you having to use all your cooldowns and heals and so forth. And he gave us a little bit of trouble again this time around. Not ultimately wiping us out too many times, but yeah, I got my legendary pants out of it, so it was all good.
Nice. Yeah, I was
Congratulations.
just gonna ask about gear drop. Jobui, did you get any new upgrade gear off any of these?
No, I didn't. No, I got a piece of gear. I got a trinket that was like higher item level, but it's not as nice a trinket as the trinkets that I currently had. So no, I did not end up with any upgrades out of this week's raid.
Well, I did notice it's not a big bump in item level between normal and heroic for the amount of work that we're putting into it, I suppose. But no, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's 10 item levels. I think it's 855 base for normal and 865 base for heroic. It does make a difference. But I just a lot of the gear for me out of Emerald Nightmare that I really, drool over, so to speak, comes from some of the later few bosses, such as the tree, which is Ilgnoth, Heart of Corruption, Cenarius, and Xavius. They're really the ones that are going to drop the pieces of gear that I'm looking for.
So we did have to, and I know Tap's not here to talk about it, but I did notice that they were having a little bit more problems with their mana this time, especially on the tree. She even commented to me after the fight that it was a pretty intense mana fight, and mana management was very important to her, and that was on the tree.
Yeah,
especially when dispelling. Yeah.
I think that goes. Yeah, I think that actually goes back to what Laureli was talking about the mechanics and stuff.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, that particular fight has some debuffs that go out onto players that are particularly hardcore, and that fight has always been kind of a mana draining fight because there is so much damage going out to players, and the healers do have to try and keep up with it. So yeah, I could easily see where that's a bit of a struggle on that, but it also is in some ways a little bit of the laziness that comes into play of not stepping out of the fire and not getting those interrupts out when they need to go out and that kind of thing that caused the raid to take a little bit more damage, which sucks the mana out of the healers.
Yeah, and you combine that with it being the later boss in a raid. There's always an effect if you're doing it later that people might not be on top of their game or using all their cooldowns or being entirely aware what's going on. So that might have been a factor. But yeah, from a tank perspective, it's not that much more difficult, and especially once you've learned the drill, right? You have to use your cooldowns and mitigate a lot of the incoming damage. And if you're doing that as a tank, it's fairly straightforward. But I guess there's a lot more raid-wide damage going around.
Yeah, plus on that fight and heroic, the stuff comes out a lot faster. The ads come out quicker, and if we're not killing those fast enough, they're going to keep damaging the raid. And if we lost a couple of DPS here or a couple of DPS there, then that's less damage going out to get those things down in a timely manner, and then they start to build up, and they start to build up fast.
Yeah, and then we overwhelm the healers.
Yeah, so that might have been what she was talking about. It was just, I think it's a lot of it was just, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was just a lot of, we haven't been to the tree in a while because we've been bouncing over to Trials of Valor, and taking that guy down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, heck, I was even out of practice on some of the order of when things were gonna up, because that's one of the fights that I typically call, and that, like keeping up with not only keeping up with the pace, but just trying to remember as the flow was going. I was a bit out of practice about, what's next and what do we do at this point kind of thing. And I was trying to stay on top of that, but boy, it can be tough.
You have to go back and look at your old notes,
Yeah.
uncrinkle your post-it note. Go, what order was that?
Exactly. Yeah, it's tough, man.
All right, so let's educate our listeners a little bit here. So what I talked about in the opening was a noob. So let's define what some of these lingo words that we use, and keep in mind some of our listeners aren't necessarily new or old active players, and they know what we're talking about. For instance, when we say DPS or nerf or NPC, BOE, BOP. I mean, those are all great terms, but if you're not, if you're pretty new to the game, what do those mean? So why don't we have a list in front of us. Why don't we just start off with Jobui and pick a couple, three of them and explain them to the best of your ability. And then if somebody wants to comment on them, go ahead.
All right. Well, I'll start off with just a simple one because it's it's my main role is DPS, which also relates to just damage itself. DPS stands for damage per second, and that's essentially how fast you can deal out damage. Now, the damage is different than DPS in some regards because DPS is how much damage per second you can dish out, whereas damage is just how much overall damage you do to the boss. Because there are times when, especially as a fire mage right now, where I get these bursts of damage, and my DPS goes skyrocketing, like really high, and then there are these lulls where I have not as many spells to cast at that moment, or not as many tricks up my sleeve or I'm waiting on cooldowns and stuff, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a minute. That I can't do as much damage during that time. So my overall damage might be very, very good, even though my DPS is dropping down a little bit. Another good term for people to know would be nerf. Nerf, it of course refers to the toy, which is like a foam bat or a foam ball kind of thing, and players talk about that when they take a spell or an ability that usually one that does damage, but it can be any other kind of stat really, and they lower the value of that stat. So let's say that I have a sword and my sword does 100 points of damage, and then through balancing, they reduce that damage to say 80 points of damage instead. That would constitute that weapon being nerfed. And same could apply to spells, or to armors, or to effects, or to heals.
Or to bosses.
Or to bosses, yeah. Sometimes they'll nerf a boss where the boss has this much health, or he does this much damage, and they nerf the boss, which means it has less health, or it does less damage. So yeah, that's a great one.
So is there one for when they go the other direction?
Well, yeah, but that's kind of a double. The other one going the other direction would be a buff. Now, buff in WoW has a couple of meanings. It can mean a spell that's applied to a player that is, or some sort of effect that's applied to a player through eating food or drinking a flask that improves the strength of that player. And then, of course, the same thing sort of applies to like a boss or an item level or a spell, where if my spell does a certain amount of damage, and then they change the spell, and now the spell does more damage, than that spell would have been buffed, or the boss might have more health or do more damage than it did before.
A common way that bosses get buffed, which people may not know about, is the fact that they scale the boss depending on the number of players in the raid. So that if you have 15 people in, the boss has a certain amount of health, but then you add another 2 players, and then there's a percentage that the boss's health goes up. So it's just that much harder to kill.
Yeah, and that scales all the way from 10 players up to 30 players.
Awesome. How about Laureli? You got a couple of definitions, couple of lingo explanations?
Sure. I'm going to describe main. And main is what you refer to the character that you play the most, the one that you've spent probably most of your time developing and upgrading and raiding with. Lorelei is my main, but I've got a lot of other tunes that I play in different other raids on weekends, things like that. BOA are items that are bind on account. Those are things that you can share with other tunes that you have. You can mail them back and forth. Those would be your heirlooms, things that you buy from the WoW store. And let's see, dailies. Those are things that people who have played WoW are very, very familiar with. And these are quests, repeatable quests that we do every day to get more gold, get gear, get upgrades for our class halls or our old garrisons. And they're just things to keep you busy while you're waiting to raid on the weekend or at night.
Awesome. So you talked about mains. Is there a term for the other tunes?
There is. It's called alts for your alternative characters.
Awesome. And how about Epistle? You got a few that you want to talk about?
Oh yeah, I'll talk about the tanky ones. Because for a tank, you're always using your cooldowns, and a cooldown is when there's in essence a timer for one of your, in the case of a tank, one of your things that helps to protect you, or potentially does a self heal. So you want to use your cooldowns every time they're up in order to be able to diminish the damage coming in. So imagine you're a tank and in a fight, arbitrarily we'll say you take 1 million damage. But a combination of things, say for example your armor, will take out maybe 40-45% of that incoming damage. Suddenly the healer's job is a whole lot easier. But then say you have one of the things that I like, an Avenger's Shield, which just recently got buffed because of my new legendary gear that I got. What that does is that even adds another kind of mitigation. An extra kind of shield gets cast whenever you throw that out there. And lots of tanks have different abilities like that. This is the mitigation. It bumps up your kind of self-protection, the kind of shield, so it diminishes the incoming damage even more. So the goal of a tank is mitigate, make sure that, arbitrarily saying 1 million points gets way down to maybe 200,000-300,000 damage. So you'll hear some tanks, though, being called squishy. And squishy would mean that, well, you know what? They're going to take a lot of that damage. And they're going to make healers' lives really, really hard. I don't know that there's an opposite for a squishy tank, other than maybe a solid tank per se.
I would say epic.
Oh, there you go.
An
Hello.
epic tank. Hey, Tap.
Hey, Tap.
Hi everyone, sorry I'm late.
That's all right.
We're just
So,
talking
Tap-
about what makes healers happy by having tanks that are easy to heal.
That is on the top of my list. And DPS that knows how to get out of stuff is very helpful as well, and I love them.
Well, that's the other thing I was going to add. Almost every class now in the last little while has developed their own personal cooldowns. So tanks will have 4 or 5 tricks, and often they're meant to handle, say, really big damage that a boss is going to deal out, either physical or magical, and they're often set up to counter either of those. But each individual player should have different ways of mitigation or self-heals, and they should be hotkeyed. There's a term I don't know that we have set up, meaning it's right available somewhere in your keyboard. You just very quickly can click it without having to hunt and find it. So it's just right available. So you got it hotkeyed so you can immediately tap into that. So if there's a bunch of AoE damage that's done and you're getting close to death, there's a way you can throw up your own, mages have shields. Some of the classes have iron bark or other things to protect themselves or to mitigate damage. You should know what that is because you're going to have that emergency situation coming up.
There are 3 classes, basically. 3 classes, there's kind of a 4th, but it's the same as the one. So there's DPS, which we talked about. There's a tank, and then there's a healer. So a DPS is somebody who's going to just, all their job is to do DPS. And a tank maintains aggro, and I'll let the tank explain aggro, holds aggro on the boss so it doesn't switch to somebody else unless they deliberately want it to switch. So a tank is kind of, I'm not going to say the leader of the group, but it's a very, very important person because it keeps the attention of the boss. And then there's the healers, which that kind of goes I don't know, self-explanation. I mean, healers are just, they're the best people in the world, right, Tap?
They're always wonderful people.
Oh, now you tell me that.
So, Tap, what we were doing is just talking about World of Warcraft lingo and explain some of those terms that we use to some of the newer players.
Oh,
You know,
yeah. There are a lot of terms we use. I'm sure people may not know what they mean.
when I think of tanks, DPS, and healers, I like to think of it as the tanks are the shield, the DPS are the sword, and the healers are the bandages.
Yeah, I like that. So, Tap, you're a big band-aid.
Well, and the tanks are the ones with the leash that will hopefully lead the boss around where it should be.
So, since we're still on you, Epistle, why don't you talk a little bit about aggro? What is aggro and what does it do?
Well, I think you covered it really well. The idea is you want the boss's attention. You want it taking all its major damages and putting it onto one individual player, or in a case of raids, often two. And so what happens is they have something called a taunt, which is a good way to start. Some other classes have it as well and realize that they get themselves into trouble if they use it in a raid. But a taunt gets that boss to attack you. It defaults usually it's like a 5-second window or something like that where the boss will look at you and nothing else. Unless there's another taunt, you have sole attention. But then the tank has to do something called building threat. And so the threat is basically how mad the mob is at you. So the tanks are designed through all their abilities to increase their threat on a boss over time. And if you mouse over, you can sometimes see a number. It comes out as a percentage. So some tanks might have 300, 400, 500% threat, which means unless there's an enormous amount of damage, the tank's probably going to maintain threat. Earlier, it used to be harder to maintain that threat. Some DPS could, if they were strong enough, pull off a tank. But lately, it's been fairly easy for tanks to, with just the mechanics as they are, maintain threat, except under exceptional circumstances. For example, sometimes some bosses drop threat, and that can be a bit unnerving. If you ever had a boss turn around and decide to hit you all of a sudden, that's because they've dropped threat and the tank has to retaunt, or you have to run, or some other mechanic kicks in. So it's all about building that threat as a tank so that there's no problem with other things getting hit. Now, a complicating factor, and we found this in the spider boss last night too, is sometimes adds will come, meaning smaller, fairly easy to kill, but damage dealing mobs that come into the middle of the raid. You got to take those and get their attention right away as a tank. Otherwise, they run willy-nilly and cause all kinds of damage. That's where it's also helpful to have something like a hunter. They've got a talent called misdirect. So if you've got scattered mobs that are hard to gather up for a tank, they can misdirect, which means that they take the threat they would create through their damage and misdirect it or redirect it to the tank. And so the tank then builds the threat on those ads. So we found, first time in a long time, I think, we've had to do this. Last night we had to redirect some of the spiders that spawned because we were kind of sprawled out in a room, and it was impossible to gather them all up at once, but there were 4 mobs. They could have done a lot of damage, so we had hunters doing the redirect, and that can sometimes solve an otherwise intractable tanking problem. So that's threat in a nutshell.
I think a couple of DPS ones that might be important to our listeners would be single target and AoE. Single target means that you're focusing your attacks upon one target. Usually it's the boss in a raid situation. So you're primarily only hitting that target that you're trying to damage. AoE, on the other hand, which stands for area of effect. Area of effect spells are spells that have usually a distance in which the damage travels or is spread amongst multiple targets. For an example, when those spiders are being gathered up by the tanks and being misdirected to the tanks, once they're gathered up, I will cast a spell that is an AoE spell that will damage all of those spiders at the same time in order to try and kill them all quickly. Another form of AoE is called cleave. And cleave damage is when you damage one target, but some of that or you're targeting one target kind of thing, but some of the damage that you apply to that one target gets spread out or gets applied to other targets that are nearby the target that you're attacking.
And from a healing perspective, all of those terms also mean something to a healer. An AoE, or an area of effect, is a spell that will heal, more than one person at a time. For instance, Tranquility covers an area that heals a lot of people. And then you have your single target spells that heal one person. Say you're healing up the tank, then you would be putting spells on that tank. And back on aggro, healers can also have what's called healing aggro, which say some ads come out and you have a lot of your heal over time spells on different people. Well, I guess the mobs and the bosses really don't like you healing your fellow raiders, so you'll end up getting what's called healing aggro, and the ads may spawn on you or go towards you. Then a hunter could misdirect them, or you can run towards the tank and the tank will get them off you. Those are a couple of the different things that you can do if you have that healing aggro.
Yeah, aggro is another word for threat, really, that I was using. And so you don't want to develop that threat or aggro as a healer or DPS and pull it off the tank. But if you do run to the boss, here's another trick you have to watch for is bosses sometimes also do a cleave. They will hit multiple targets, and often it's in front of the boss. So if you don't know this yet and you've ever run into the front of a boss, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you'll get hit with something that really only a tank should be absorbing, and you'll get one shot. One shot meaning you'll be hit in one shot.
And die.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that important bit, yeah.
So as a healer, Tap, what are some of the things that, some of the abbreviations, like res, battle res, that healers deal with that you'd want to talk about and explain?
Well, we have terms like you'll hear a healer say, I've got huts on these so-and-so people, or I'll hut the raid and you can heal the tank. And huts are heal over time effects, so you can put spells on people that heal, like it says, over time. So you might have a healing touch that will heal, give so much percent heals to somebody over so many seconds. We have also our, like I said, the healing over time huts. We have our single target where we're just healing one person. Sometimes in a raid, you might assign healers different roles. You might have healers that just heal the tank, healers that heal the raid, meaning they heal everybody else but the tank. You might have another healer that heals the off tank, so that's like I don't know if you explained tank and off tank, but that's like the secondary tank. They work together, the tank and the off tank as a team. So you'll hear, things like that. Okay, so and so is gonna raid heal, and such person's gonna tank heal, and that's kind of what those terms mean.
I think a couple of terms that we didn't exactly cover, but we did talk about a little bit. Aggro, which of course he said is threat, is actually short for like aggravation, which you've aggravated the boss, you've made it angry at you. Another important one, especially for new raiders, is wipe. Wipe means everybody dies and you lose and you just have to try again, kind of thing. And that happens not just in raiding, but of course dungeons as well, where anytime you've got a group of people and everybody in your group gets wiped out, that's a wipe.
You may even hear the raid leader or your dungeon leader say, okay, let's wipe it up, which just means go stand in some stuff and kill yourself off as quickly as possible, because it's not going to happen. No matter what you do, there's no way you're going to get that particular boss down or ads down. And speaking of ads, who wants to explain what an ad is?
I think we covered it a little bit. Ads are basically additional mobs, or which a mob is any monster or creature or whatever that you're fighting against that comes into play during usually a boss fight. So if you're fighting, for an example, on the spider boss, you're fighting the main spider, and then she calls down some of her minions, which are smaller spiders that will come and attack people. And so we have to take care of the ads or those extra spiders.
And we should start at the beginning. The beginning of the fight is when the boss starts to attack people. And that gets triggered by one of two things. Either somebody pulls it by hitting it or taunting it, or else somebody accidentally moves just a little too close. And if you accidentally move too close, we call that a face pull, meaning you kind of pulled it with your face just by putting your face too close to the boss and it decides to hit you. So generally, you'll see something called a pull timer that raids will do, not like a looking for raid, an LFR situation, but in a well-organized raid. Usually a tank will give you a countdown timer, or the raid leader will give a countdown timer to let you know that they're going to pull in a certain amount of time. And then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the tank will hit the taunt or throw a shield or whichever to get the encounter started. So right off the get-go, the boss will come straight to a tank. If you go too early, it can have other consequences, like people pre-pot. We've talked about that, I think, at other times. But it really messes people up if you get the timing off. So you always wait until just that half second after the tank is pulled to hit the boss with your first damage or cast your first heals.
Yeah, and a lot of times the raid leader will throw out what's called a ready check. And what that means is it's not just an annoyance that comes up saying, "Are you ready?" It means, "Are you ready?" Because as soon as the ready check has all been completed and everybody's there, ready to go, we're going to start our countdown, our pull timer. So, when you use that ready check, make sure you're ready. So we can get started, because that just makes everything go a lot faster, and it gives you more time on the boss, more time in the raid, because all the little things that delay everything, really cuts down on raid time that you can be playing. I was going to actually talk about face pull, because hunters love to face pull.
Well, the hunter seems to.
The hunter, yes. The
Yeah.
hunter.
I was going to say that. The hunter.
A lot of times face pulls are accidental, and if it is, and if you do it, it's not a big deal. Just admit to it and say, "Oh, sorry, that was me. I apologize. I was targeting the boss and I hit the wrong button. The cat ran across the keyboard." Whatever your excuse is. People have heard them all. It's no biggie. So, anybody else got any they want to talk about? We talked about noob, and I mentioned that in the introduction. And a noob is a new player. It's basically somebody who is got no experience in what they're doing. It's not a term of endearment, although
No.
I think some people think it is. But it's nothing to be ashamed of either, because if you're new and you screw up, people are just going to get mad. But if you announce, "Hey, look, I have never done this before. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm a noob," don't be afraid of it. So,
I think sometimes it can be a term of endearment. I think it depends on the context. Like if somebody's like, "Oh, that guy's a noob," that's a negative context. But like, "Oh, they're newbies," that's a more positive tone.
yes.
You want to take them under your wing and show them the ropes.
Yeah. I think another really great one for brand new players would be NPC, which is non-player character. Those are automated, scripted characters that are in the World of Warcraft environment that you can interact with, usually. Sometimes you can't interact with them. Sometimes they just stand there and you can't actually talk to them or anything. But that stands for any character that is not a person. There's no one controlling it, not directly anyway. The programmers have pre-programmed in what those characters will do, and that's what they will do.
Yeah. So there's a couple others, and I think I want Laureli to talk about it, because she doesn't get a lot of talk time. But BOE and BOP.
BOE and BOP refer to items that you can find in dungeons and raids and world things and everything. BOE is called bind on equip, and that means you can hold on to it and it does not become what we call soulbound, which then it belongs to you and you can't give it to anybody. As long as you don't equip it, you can put it on the auction house, you can give it to somebody, or whatever you want to do with it. BOP is bind on pickup, which means when you pick that item up, it becomes yours and you're not allowed to trade it. But now they've kind of changed that. You really can trade things to other players while you're in the raid with them, which is nice. It's nice that they did that instead of just having to sell those things. And yeah, I think we talked about bind on account, so we covered that one. So there's lots of binds that you can do in the game.
Yeah. So I saw Epistle writing a few more down, so we'll let him talk a little bit more.
I will say something about "don't stand in the fire," because you'll hear that phrase used quite often. And fire, I don't know whether it's because it was the original vanilla WoW that the phrase came from, but fire is basically damage that's on the floor. And if you're standing in that and you die to that, it's very irritating, because that's kind of one of the most obvious things you would think, is that you're standing in something that's killing you and you take 2 steps and you live. Moving would be a good thing. But for a lot of reasons, when you're new to the game, you may not realize that, you may not get a warning, you may not be aware, you may not see it, and so you might die to it. So the phrase "don't stand in the fire" basically means you could just move out of the damage and all would be well. Yeah, probably a little like noob, it could be a negative if you're dying to something like that. And I've even been in groups where healers, farmers won't even heal somebody if they stand in the fire. They figure it's not worth wasting their mana on them, which is a bit harsh, but
Sometimes you
good.
have no choice.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
I think that actually comes from the Molten Core, which was the
wondering.
very first raid of WoW. And that one was all about fire. And I think that's where that originated from, actually.
So it could be anything. It could be green goop. It could be a beam that's hitting the floor from somewhere. Any number of things. And that's why we recommend the GTFO add-on or Deadly Boss mods. Add-ons that basically make it very clear in very audible terms that you should not be there right now. And those are really helpful just letting you know you got to take a couple steps.
Yeah, as a raid leader, we call that avoidable damage, because it's not necessarily something that would be on the floor. It may be a whirlwind that's spinning around, or being next to somebody who has some sort of buff on them that's causing damage, pulsating damage. And because it's on them, they're not taking any damage, or they might take a little bit of what we call ticking damage, which ticking just means it's over, the damage comes in over time. The longer you have it on you, the more damage you take, or until it gets dispelled is another good one. But avoidable damage is where the healers aren't necessarily healing you because you're avoiding that damage, where you're not taking any. They don't have to cast a spell on you. They can use that mana to go to the tank and put it on them. So anybody else got any more ones they want to talk about? We talked about cooldowns, self heals. Okay, self heals. Yep, I don't think we talked about that one. I'm going to let Tapachino. Sorry, I'm going to let Tapachino talk a little bit about self heals because she's the healer.
Well, self heals are spells that you have, or it could be a flask or a potion of healing tonic or something that you use on yourself. So you're self-healing yourself. Obviously, the healers are going to be healing everybody, but we have to be, aware that we also have to self-heal. We need to keep ourselves up if we're going to keep ourselves up, meaning keep ourselves from dying, keep our health up, so that we can in turn, keep the rest of the raid up. So self-heals are very important, and they are very helpful to a healer if you have your own self-heals and that when is the right time to use them. Another self-heal could be from a warlock health stone. That's the stones that warlocks can give you. You can carry 3 at a time, and you can use those to self-heal yourself. So that will, especially if the fight's intense, the healers can get low on mana. It's harder takes longer to regenerate while you're fighting, and that can really help and make a difference in the fight. Is if you can self-heal, save the healers their mana so that they can in turn, keep the raid up, and all that working together can make for a very nice, successful kill on the boss. And hopefully some good loot.
Hopefully, loot's always good.
Yep.
So,
And loot is gear, by the way. That's anything that you could.
Yes.
That's anything that you can get in the game that is helpful to you, whether you can sell it or you can wear it or equip it. That's loot, and that seems to be one of the main focuses of most players is the acquisition of mad loots.
Mhm.
Looting is the name of the game. That does not mean to pillage when we loot.
It's more like a looty call.
So if you, as our listeners, would like a specific term, something you've heard and you're not quite sure what it is, go ahead and shoot me an email at lionspridetavern@yahoo.com. And we'll get that on the air and we'll answer that and try to explain it for you. So let's move on to another listener of ours asked about Easter eggs or hidden areas in the game that we've found, and talk a little bit about them. I know there's a few out there, and we're just going to start off. If you guys just want to pick one or maybe two that you want to talk about, we'll start off with Jobui. Any hidden areas or Easter eggs?
The one hidden area Easter eggy thing that I've gone through and done. It's the single most complex one I've run into, which would be the Kasumoth the Hungering, down to the southern part of the Broken Isles. There is an Eye of Azshara island down there. It's the same island that is used in the dungeons, the Eye of Azshara dungeon, actually. And basically, there's this character out on the broken shore, and if you talk to that character, you can end up picking up this item, and then you have to travel around all over the Broken Isles to these various hidden caves and alcoves and different spots and perform these different tasks, collect these different things, touch these different things. And if you do all of that in the right order, then eventually you will unlock Kasumoth the Hungering, which is a world boss kind of character that shows up down on the Eye of Azshara Island and drops a mount that is like a jellyfish. It's an underwater speed increaser mount. Drops a pet called the Hungering Claw. A couple of other items as well, I think. And there's it varies from week to week, but you can't see that world boss until you've completed that Easter egg. It doesn't even really come up as a quest. It's just this item, and then you have to go to find these spots. And really, I highly recommend looking up a guide if that's something you want to do.
Awesome. Lorelei.
Sure. I stumbled across while questing in Northrend over in Sholazar Basin. There's a little island out in one of the rivers, and I noticed something very strange on it, and it looked like a hatch in the ground. So I walked over there, and there were some numbers on it, and that's when I realized that was their homage to the TV show Lost, where you had the hatch in the ground that they discovered and this number that kept showing up all over the place. And I think there's also a coffin on that island, which is another reference to a coffin that was found on the island that they were all lost on. So I love all these little Easter egg things that they have. Sometimes you just run across them and you go, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. I wonder how they got that in the game, which is like the Plants and Zombie game over near Terran Mill, which became a quest, and you had to learn how to play the game in order to complete the quest.
I remember that one. I went over there and did that several times. I just thought it was fun to do. Epistle, you got a hidden area or Easter egg?
Not so much hidden area as sort of, I don't know, I'm a sucker for recurring characters. So in Northrend, one of the first quests I ever did was with Murky, and I'm going to try my best on this one, but King Murgle. And
That was good.
Yeah, thank you. So I love when Blizz kind of takes one of the characters and then just pops them into a new area and you kind of see them again. And I think one of the best laughs I had in High Mountain was when I came across Murky again, and one of the characters saying, "Oh yeah, this guy said he was, king of the Murlocs in Northrend," and I just had a giggle and had to do that quest. Always makes me happy when I see that.
And how about Tapachino?
One of the little, I don't know if it's so much hidden, but it's kind of out of the way in the Grand. There is a genie, and he was put there by Blizzard in memory of Robin Williams. And it's kind of cool to go and see it. The coordinates, if anybody's interested, is 76.12, 94.45. There's also a lamp close by that you can rub, and the genie will pop up and, say a few words. I can't exactly remember what he says, but, kudos to Blizzard for putting that there to honor such a wonderful man who loved the game and unfortunately was taken from us way too soon.
Yep. And I love the fact that they do all sorts of references. There was a reference to Indiana Jones.
Oh yeah.
Just off the top of my head. And he keeps reoccurring throughout, I think, most of the series, most of the X-Packs. X-Packs being an expansion that Blizzard puts out that kind of totally changes the whole face of the way we play. But anybody else got another one that they want to talk about?
I was wondering if we're going to talk about the recent Diablo tip of the hat.
Oh, yeah. I had heard
the
about it. I haven't experienced it yet. I think I did. I think I saw the treasure goblin or whatever it was in one of the dungeons I was running with Mommy Fortuna. And she's like, "Oh, kill that. And well, of course, and then she's like, after it's heading back to go out, you can slow it. I was like, well, if I would have known that at the beginning, we probably would have got it down. But yeah, so go ahead and talk about that one. I haven't actually experienced it.
Yeah, at the end of instances, you get this treasure goblin coming out, which is the tip of the hat to Diablo, another of Warcraft's sister games. And without going too long down the story, you can look it up. There's a story about a cow level, meaning a secret cow level, like an Easter egg that you get to find in Diablo, which they've now brought into Warcraft. So finish a dungeon, look for the treasure goblin, kill it, and it will get you a portal. The portal will then take you to the secret cow level, and you get to kill the Cow King, and he drops a little bit of loot. It's not going to change your game or massively increase your DPS, but it's a lot of fun. But while we were doing the podcast, I was looking in Dalaran, and somebody walked by with a herd of 6 angry bovines. And
I saw that.
I don't know
that's
how it's
amazing.
connected, but it's somehow connected. I don't know how you get it, but it made me laugh.
Yeah, there's you can also find those guys, those treasure goblins, in the underground of Dalaran. They spawn down in the PvP area down there as well. And there is one interesting piece of loot that's kind of useful that you can get out of that. If you do the quest, there is this, I think it's called a blank diabolic tome, and you can, if you kill the treasure goblin, you can when you loot it, you can get the scrolls of Town Portal, and if you collect 10 of those scrolls of Town Portal and combine it with the blank diabolic tome, you will get a alternative Hearthstone. Now, Hearthstones, most players should know what a Hearthstone is. Basically, it's an item that takes you back to one of the inns in the game that you can set which inn that's assigned to. But the difference with this one is that it's a toy. And so that means that you don't actually have to keep it in your inventory, because now that we have the toy library, you can activate that as a link directly out of your toy library. So that could be one less item that takes up space in your bag. You could put your Hearthstone in your bank, and then you don't have to carry around an extra item, because you can use that that diabolic tome to get back to an inn instead. There's also another item in the game called the Innkeeper's Daughter that is very similar to that can be gotten.
And like in Diablo, the treasure goblin will only be around as far as when he spawns. He's only there for a certain amount of time, so you got to kill him kind of quick, or else he creates a portal for himself and takes off, and you miss out on the loot.
Yeah, and this from what I understand, this Diablo one is because they're on their anniversary, if I remember right.
20 years.
Yep. So
Fun game. It's a very fun game.
So you need to take advantage of it now. Why the treasure goblins are out there. So don't miss out on that one. Go kill the king cow. All right, 7.1.5. Let's talk a little bit about the new patch coming out Tuesday. It's been pre-patched to us already. If you've noticed that when you start up your BattleNet, it might even come up down there saying that it's preloading a patch. If you don't have that turned on, it is definitely an option you should, because on the day the patch comes out, it sometimes can be murder if you've got 4 million players trying to download the patch at the same time. So Jobui, you want to? I know as far as characters, like with my hunter, my Beastmaster hunter, they're making a lot of improvements that increase the amount of damage that each one of my spells or abilities do. Looks pretty significant too, by what I've been reading. So why don't you just kind of explain what 7.1.5 is going to do for us?
Well, 7.1.5 is essentially Blizzard took a look at what was happening with gear, which was basically you could get a piece of gear that is an item level, say 850, and then later pick up a piece of gear that's an item level 870. Now, your natural inclination would be that, oh, I can put this on, it's higher item level, this is going to be better for my character, I'll be able to be more powerful. But that wasn't always the case in Legion, because the secondary stats, things like crit, mastery, versatility, those things, haste, they played a major role in how much damage each of our characters could do, or how powerful we would be, how much damage we could mitigate. So what Blizzard wanted to do with 7.1.5 is to take those secondary stats and kind of make them all a little bit more equal. So for an example, your versatility would be roughly equal to how valuable haste would be for your character, and how valuable your mastery would be, or your critical strike. And by taking those stats and making them more in line with each other so that they're all equally beneficial for the most part, not necessarily 100% equally, but more equal than they currently are, it means that when you get that piece of 870 gear, there's a very, very good chance that 870 gear is going to be better for your character than the 850 gear. And that's really the focus of this particular patch, is to try and make it so that characters aren't so dependent upon one particular secondary stat. Like with fire mages, that stat is crit. We are completely dependent upon crit. If an item doesn't have crit on it, we pretty much don't even want it. And there's a lot of gear out there that seems like it would be good for a fire mage, like as an upgrade, but it's not, because it doesn't have crit. And losing crit means losing a lot of power. So this patch is really attempting to address that. It's also attempting to address different classes where they felt that they needed to be made either a little bit more powerful, or maybe a little less powerful, or change the way that they are powerful. Now, I'm personally focused a lot on the fire mages because that's what I play primarily. And in fire mages, our damage in Legion, which I'm so glad they made fire mages a good class to play again, because it's one of my favorite classes in the game since the very beginning, or classes and specs. Our damage is primarily contained inside what would be known as a burst. All right. Now, a burst is a short period of time in which we can do an enormous amount of damage And then after that burst is over and our stuff is on cooldowns, and we're waiting for those spells to be available to us again, our damage is pretty low. And so we're very dependent upon these moments of high bursting damage versus our overall sustained damage. And one of the ways that they're changing fire mages is that our burst is not going to be as catastrophically awesome as it currently is, but our sustained damage is going to be significantly higher. So they changed some of our they changed some of the talents. They turned some talents from ones that you could choose into what's known as a baseline talent, which is one that is just automatically applied to your character. And then they created some new talents, because they're also trying to make the talent rows themselves, which is basically it's just different choices at different levels. You're given 3 choices of talents, and you can select which one of those you want to use in your character. And most of the time right now, if players want to be competitive, they have one choice. And, usually it's one choice for the most part as to what in that row they need to take. And you select this one, this one, this one, and this one. And it's very dry, and it doesn't allow for a lot of variation in individual specs. And they're trying to make those come into closer parity with each other as well. So with this patch, you may look at that row, and based on the way you like to play your character, picking this talent over that talent might actually be better for you than it will be for some other player who plays slightly different. So they're trying to make those talents a little bit more of a personal choice as opposed to a default choice that you would go for. And I think that that's the overall primary focus of the 7.15 patch, is to try and bring more choices in talents, to balance out the secondary stats, and to try and bring a little bit more parity amongst the different classes and specs.
Awesome. Anybody else got any comments on 7.15?
Well, the Resto Druid or Restoration Druid isn't going to get too many tweaks. Actually, very little. I guess we're just good the way we are. But I do know the Balance Druid is getting some a little bits of modifications. I'm not quite sure about the Feral and Guardian, but perhaps I'll know more next week.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely looks like everybody's getting tweaked a little bit. I mean, from the list that I saw, it looked like about every class was listed there. So.
I have to say, for the most part, it looks like it's improvements. A lot of times, they come in and they really hurt some classes. But I'm checking out the Havoc Demon Hunter as well, and they seem to, even though people thought they were too powerful, they may have been at first, but once Legion was released, they kind of got caught up with what everybody else was, where they were. But it looks like even they're getting some buffs and very little on the other end.
There's also some other really neat little things too that are coming along with 7.15, like some flavor changes. For example, with mages, our shield has been ice barrier for ages. That's like a little personal shield we can pop up a lot, and they are changing it so now there's a specific one for arcane. They get some kind of arcane shield, and then or temporal shield, I think is what they call it. And then fire mages are getting a fiery shield, whereas the ice mage or the frost mages will have a frosty shield instead. They'll still have the ice barrier. So I think that's kind of a neat little thing. That's something I've wanted for a really long time, because I'm a fire mage, I'm all fiery, and then I run around with icicles around me all the time. Seemed weird.
Yeah, it's kind of contradictory.
The other thing they're adding, which is going to be neat, is the Mist of Pandaria time walking. So that'll give us some variety when it's time to do time walkings.
Oh, that'll be fun. I like those dungeons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did too.
They're also doing some balancing to legendary items. Some legendary items that were considered like the best, and if you didn't have this one, then you weren't competitive, have been nerfed to make them more in line with the other legendaries. And some of the legendaries that were considered junk by a lot of players have been improved, had their stuff changed so that they are significantly more useful or generally better than they were originally. Because they want the legendaries to be a choice of play style as opposed to, again, like the talents were a default. You need this one. And if you don't have this one, you might as well not have it, or not have a legendary kind of thing. They want the legendaries to be something that are cool no matter which one you get.
Oh, that's good to hear.
All right, guys. Well, we are approached our hour. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Next week, we got more raids, and we'll have 7.15 to talk about, I'm sure, now that we'll have it live and we'll be able to test out what we're doing. So thanks, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you,
next
everyone.
week.
If you like this podcast, throw us a like and subscribe to our channel. And please, leave comments or questions below. Maybe we'll answer them on the air next podcast. We are hosted on Podomatic.com. Our website is lionspridetavern.podomatic.com. Our podcast also airs on iTunes for Apple users, Google Play for Androids, and YouTube. Just search World of Warcraft Lions Pride Tavern Podcast. See you next week, and thanks for listening.